Hello, I'm Ian Dunt. I'm a columnist with the Eye and the author of How to Be a Liberal, and I'm here to eat chocolate and drink whiskey.
So this is the very first episode of Whisky and Cacao, which is our YouTube channel where we Cocoa Runners are having whiskey and chocolate boxes with our guests, and our first guest is Mr. Ian Dunt.
Hello.
Hello Ian, could you tell me about why you drink whiskey, or you like whiskey and chocolate, you're quite known for it?
I don't know if I am known for it. I mean, you and I talk about it quite a bit. I drink whiskey. I never used to drink very much whiskey. I was kind of more of a Menakao person, and a little bit, and maybe a bit of rum. And then I got into a romantic relationship with a Scottish woman, and that was basically the end of that. So now it's just whiskey for the rest of my life. Kind of as some sort of patriotic imperative. So yeah, I've fully succumbed.
So you moved on from, like, because your mother was Guatemalan, but your mother's Guatemalan, isn't she?
Yeah. So there was tequila when you're growing up, and then, growing up, they didn't force feed it to me when I was 8. But yeah, as I was growing up, that was part of it. And after a while, once you try Menakao, you just sort of think, well, that's just objectively better than tequila, really. So then you just start getting into Menakao quite heavily. And now it's whiskey is pretty much, apart from Menakao, the only spirit that I drink, certainly straight. But even the rest of it, I look at the bottles in my house, and they all stay at exactly the same level, whereas the whiskey bottles, we just came back from holiday. It was like, what happened to that bottle? It's like, I'll tell you what happened to the bottle. We smashed that bottle. So yeah, we're now in a pretty heavy professional approach towards whiskey.
That is always a good way to be. So one of the things I'm going to try and get you into this time as well is whiskey and craft chocolate.
Yes, excellent.
Now, there is a reason that I think they go well together, apart from they taste really well together, is that I think craft chocolate's where whiskey would like to be. Sorry, the other way around. Whiskey is where craft chocolate would like to be, because there is so many problems, I think, with chocolate in terms of cocoa farmers not getting enough money, there being far too many additives in chocolate. When you look at what cheap chocolate is, you're like, that's got about 1%. And it's just cocoa mint nibs.
Right.
Whereas with craft chocolate, what you generally have is about 3 or 4 ingredients. You just have some kind of cocoa mass. You have basically cocoa, sugar, and if it's a milk chocolate, you've got some milk powder, and that is it. Mm-hmm. Which in the end, whiskey, no matter what quality of whiskey the whiskey is, it's just got 3 ingredients. It's just a grain, yeast, and water, and that's it. Mm-hmm. Also, I think farmers get a decent salary for growing barley or growing wheat for the whiskey industry. And with craft chocolate, the farmers always get a really good deal. The first chocolate we're going to have is Conexion chocolate. And that is set up by a woman called Jennifer Sampio. And what she did was really try to develop a chocolate industry so that people would not leave Ecuador and move to the cities. They would stay in the countryside, and she was giving them a decent living as farmers. Mm-hmm. Which is, you've been around Scotland, you've seen how many distilleries are in rural areas. Mm-hmm. And again, without that, people would just move to the city because there's nothing for them to do. Mm-hmm. So there's that social reason, but there's also, they go really well together. I have had a lot of whiskey and a lot of chocolate in the past few months because I have suffered for these subscription
I can imagine
boxes.
how terrible that must have been for you.
Oh, it was horrendous. It was really hard, let me tell you. And so I have basically found the whiskies and chocolates that go really well together, because sometimes they don't. Mm-hmm. This pairing, I think, goes really well. But I'm not sure if this whiskey as an entry will be your favourite whiskey. But
what whiskey is this?
It's Loch Lomond, and it's a single grain whiskey.
I'm fully sceptical of Loch Lomond, but I'm prepared to be wrong. You know what? And I don't even have a good... I was in Loch Lomond, I was in a pub, I got some Loch Lomond whiskey, and I thought, that's a bit coppery. It's a little bit... It just tasted a bit kind of like blunt and unforgiving. Yeah, so I don't like that. But that is my one and only sort of testing, really.
Right, this one is different. This is a single grain whiskey as opposed to a malt whiskey, and what it is very soft and kind of perfumey. So if you're not used to whiskey, it's a really, really good whiskey to start off with. But you'll notice it's much lighter than malt whiskies. Mm-hmm. So it's not. You'll even notice in the taste in your mouth. Grain whiskey is generally lighter in the mouth than a malt whiskey.
Okay,
so you want to try the whiskey first?
Definitely, I do.
It is, I think, 40%. Let me check. 45%.
Smells delicious. That's really nice.
There you go, you see. Anybody would think that I was good at what I do.
This situation concerns me, by the way, because whenever I have to have food and drink at the same time, You have the same with like cheese and wine tasting.
Mm-hmm.
I just always think I'm going to cock it up somehow. So I say, because basically what they'd be asking you to do is put the food, this is what it's like with wine, right? And I think you're going to say the same thing. You put the food in your mouth and then you put the whiskey in afterwards. So I always think, I'm going to look like a bit of a twat doing this, but now we're doing it on video. So thank you. This is essentially a trap, I think.
You will be fine, I promise. What I want you to do is have a wee bit of this chocolate and let it melt in your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
So this is 70% and it's got cacao nibs in it as well. So what you do is when you put craft chocolate in your mouth, you don't chew it, you let it melt, and then you get a lot of different tastes around your mouth, and you can tell me what you think. And it's got nibs in it, so it has got a texture.
What are the nibs?
They're cacao nibs, so they're like the top of the bean.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this is really good for a video. I have now, so I have clearly not thought this through.
Yeah, that is kind of an issue that you created here.
Mm-hmm. I hope you do.
That is unbelievably delicious. It's like kind of orangey, fruity thing to it. It's happening. I said this was going to happen. That I was going to look like a twat because you were making me talk with something in my mouth.
But it's just really good chocolate, isn't it?
It's very, very nice indeed, yeah.
And what I find with craft chocolate is, you know, when you get whiskey and you're saying you get kind of perfume, you get orange peel, you get this kind of taste. With craft chocolate, you get all sorts of tastes that you didn't expect in chocolate that you get in whiskey. And again, because people are used to really cheap chocolate and it just all tastes the same. It just tastes of sugar.
Has that not got orange in it?
Nope, that has got, read out the ingredients. Not that I need glasses immediately, so I can't read it.
Cacao mass, cane sugar, cacao butter, cacao nibs, sunflower lecithin. Lecithin.
And that's it.
That's actually quite amazing.
It hasn't got any orange flavouring. That's just the taste of pure craft chocolate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the way, it'll be the type of bean that they use, in the same way that, you know, with whiskey, you've got, it depends on the grain, the type of bean they use, and it'll be what they do with the bean. And how they temper it, how long, when they're processing it, how long they process it for. They use, really small companies use lentil grinders, because they're the only ones that, like Indian household lentil grinders, because they're the only ones that go on forever. Like, because they tried to use Magimixes and things and we're blowing them up, because you can't put a Magimix on for 12 hours, but you can put a lentil grinder on for 12 hours to grind cocoa beans. So a craft chocolate maker basically buys cocoa beans and then roasts them themselves and then makes a chocolate. And in the same way, a whiskey maker doesn't buy in alcohol, they buy in grain and water and they make it themselves.
I've got to admit, I am having a kind of sensory wave of slight euphoria right now. Just by virtue of everything that's happening around me is really very nice.
It's really, really good, isn't it? So, while you've still got that taste of chocolate in your mouth, have the whiskey.
Yeah, it really improves it. It's really earthy. It's absolutely lovely.
That's the thing, is I think you get the three tastes. So if you start off with, you have some whiskey and you get used to the taste of the whiskey. Then you have a tiny bit of chocolate and you get used to the taste of the chocolate. And then you have a whiskey again, and it should sing. For me, you've got the third flavour of them combined when it works, like this does. It should sing together, and it's a different taste experience, which is such a wanky thing to say, taste experience.
But I'm getting to that. Yeah.
So, what I want to know about you is, I know you from Twitter like everybody else.
Oh, sorry about that.
And you started live tweeting Prime Minister's Question Times. When did you start doing that, and what did it do for you, apart from just help you to not scream at other people in your house out of frustration?
I don't know. I don't know when I started doing that stuff, to be honest. I do notice that it comes up quite a bit. I think it's because people want to be able to know what's going on, but don't want to have to actually fucking watch it, because it's dreadful and corrosive for the soul to watch any of that stuff. So I think, probably like a decade ago, I would have started sort of tweeting away when stuff was going on. We used to have live blogs back in the day. Actually, do you remember when live blogs were a thing? The Guardian pretty much, I think, started it, and off we went. And so I used to have one of those where I was like a little bit abusive, but only as abusive as I could get away with. And now, if I think a debate's worth covering, it's very difficult with Parliament, because also you do need to plan a life. They won't tell you when a debate starts. They won't tell you when a debate ends. Quite often it will end up going on until sort of midnight or something. But to have a sort of transmission mechanism, I guess, is kind of helpful to people. So you want transmission for several things. You want it, first of all, to say, what the fuck is going on? Like lots of time with Parliament, the rules are very, very opaque. They're really complicated. So it's quite hard for people to know what's on an order paper, on what order do they actually vote. What does it mean when someone abstains in this way? And the content of the stuff. So I do that, but then the rest of it is really just channeling people's sense of catastrophic disdain at the characters who they're looking at. And I feel it. Like I am fucking angry all the time looking at these clowns. And so
when did it start? When do you think, if you've been doing this for 10 years, when do you think it really started to, when did you start getting worried that this was going badly wrong?
The country. I mean, it's been going pretty badly wrong since 2010. I don't want to give away any of my political opinions in any way. Like, obviously, it's been 2010, it started going wrong, and then 2016 is when we had the real double blow. Mm-hmm. And what happened in 2016 really was existential, right? Because it was Brexit followed by Trump. And that moment, to me, will always be like a defining moment in my life, because it was just the moment of thinking, oh, wait, hang on a minute. This isn't just, we can sit this out for another 4 years of bad government. Like, we're actually facing an existential threat to the values that our society is based on.
And why do you think that happened? Because you've kind of become a radical liberal, which is not, or I think you said before you described yourself as like a fundamentalist liberal, and that's not a very
extremist. Common... Yeah, I'm extreme.
You're an extreme liberal.
Well, I am. I mean, I'm extremist in my application, I think, of liberalism. And the fact that I think that it can solve pretty much all political problems that you present it with. Mm-hmm. People talk about this all the time. They talk about the freedom of the individual and liberal ideas. And liberal ideas, if you really commit to them, you have to properly reimagine the way the society looks. I mean, for a start, you would legalize all the drugs. Okay? I mean, if you really believe in the freedom of the individual, you start coming up with very radical political propositions. So to me, to be a liberal extremist is simply to take the core ideas of liberalism and be prepared to pursue them to their logical conclusion. Mm-hmm. And that spreads across sort of the policy agenda. The other is that idea of the freedom of the individual can answer almost any question you put to it. There's a few little bits and pieces here and there, like animal rights, that are slightly separate to that issue. But almost everything you look at in politics, from climate change to criminal justice to international relations, can be answered by the moral principle of the freedom of the individual. So for that, because I think it can answer all the questions, and because I hope I have the confidence of seeing through the convictions that it offers to their logical conclusion, I call myself a liberal extremist. Also, I quite like it because liberals always look like they're just a bit wishy-washy and a bit namby-pamby, exactly. And it's good to just give it a bit of way, I think.
And why do you think that it stopped working? I mean, it does seem that one of the things when I've been listening to different podcasts that you've been on, one of the things that you've been talking about quite a lot is that idea of waking up and realising this notion of progress has kind of gone. And I was thinking about this because there was a novel I read a few years ago. It was a kind of state of the nation kind of post-World War to 2000, and it was James Robertson's Underland Lay Still. And you can see that progression of council housing happens, people have jobs, people all of a sudden were going to university and becoming teachers, they were moving up they were moving up to become middle class. And it's like that isn't, there was a sense even in his book about 2000 about this party's beginning to end. Mm-hmm. People aren't getting grants to go to university anymore. Council houses aren't available like they used to be. Jobs aren't available like they used to be. What do you think what do you think happened to people lose those ideals? I
think we started losing in the late 70s. I think it's before the 2000s. Mm-hmm. It was really when you had stagflation in Britain, you had it in America as well. And you just have this economic situation that just detonates the post-war system. And the guys that come in with promises to replace it, Thatcher, Reagan, backed up intellectually, people like Milton Friedman, by Friedrich Hayek. They call it neoliberalism or laissez-faire liberalism or libertarianism. But ultimately means just let the market rip. The age of the state is over. Now that was just the most devastating thing that happened. It had no time for real individual freedom because the state wasn't there to protect it. Mm-hmm. You had no material security for people. So it doesn't matter. I mean, if you go up to a homeless person and go, oh, you've got free speech. It's like, well, it doesn't matter. You don't have the right to privacy because you don't have any material security. And people were just left as these kind of atomized units. Like, what was it to have belonging? Once the neoliberals take over, really from the 70s until now, what was it to have a sense of belonging? The real belonging was basically told us like, do you like Pepsi or Coke? Define yourself by your consumer choices.
But I would say that's not necessarily true now, especially when you look at the importance of diversity and people looking at belonging in a way they haven't before, and in terms of belonging to like the US and belonging to the UK, and looking at that when you're especially looking at ethnic minorities and how much it's, although there is still that big backlash, it is getting better for ethnic minorities in terms of their representation when you compare it to the 70s. You know, if this all went wrong in the 70s, you look at the 70s and how what it would be like to be an ethnic minority in Glasgow in the 70s or London in the 70s, and what it's like now. I mean, it's much better.
Of course, yeah.
So, I mean,
I don't think anyone's challenging that. I mean, certainly we've had improvements since the 70s. People's sense of belonging, I think, in whether it's in marginalised identity or whether it's in their sense of nation, on the other hand, is usually, I think, a response and like kind of a rebellion against neoliberalism. It's kind of this idea of like, no, actually, I do have a sense of belonging. And especially when you take away my material circumstance, you take away someone's job down the factory and say, okay, fine, so you don't get to define yourself by your status in your community or your seniority there. So how do you define yourself? You're primed for an opening by nationalists, by people like Trump, who come over and go, well, actually, there is meaning and there is belonging to you and there is status to you. It's the status of your race. It's the status of your sex. And on this basis, you can find like your community, your belonging. So most of that stuff, I think, is a rebellion. Sometimes it's positive, for instance, for marginalized people. And sometimes it's negative, for instance, for people who are basically bullying away at minorities. But all of it, I think, is a rebellion against that kind of just empty, valueless series of decades that we went through. And that is a fucking lesson to liberalism right there. Like, I mean, for that period, liberals were just left as if they had really nothing to say to people. No real ideas for how to improve their lives. And now I think they're starting to learn the lesson.
But I mean, to me, is that also identity thing was that there was very much, to me, I noticed it, maybe 2008, 2009 in London, you would see these people who kept insisting they were British but couldn't tell you what being British was about and would refuse to be English. My thing was, it's kind of like you're refusing to identify with the working class white people that you don't like. You know, Scottish people don't do that. I mean, like, even the most unionist of Scottish person in Edinburgh still knows that they're Scottish, like the craziest, you know, in the most racist white working class person in Scotland, in their head, that's what they're like. You know, they still know they're Scottish. They still identify with them as from the same country, in a way that I wondered if in England it was like that was disappearing. It was like we have this identity that we quite like and the one that we don't. And that's interesting. And I found that, I mean, I remember having conversations with people about that in 2010, thinking, this is going to come back and bite you people on the bum. Because this right now is a pub discussion, but this is not good, and I don't know. This is not a forward. This is not a way to move forward.
It's hard, you know, for people like me. If you've got a sort of immigrant heritage in England, it's quite rare. It's not unheard of by any means, but it's quite rare to associate strongly with England. England has always sort of felt, especially the flag, the rest of it too, is just this kind of quite white, quite exclusive, quite uniform idea.
When you're saying always, have you always felt that? You know, because you were saying, you know, your mother isn't English. In
my family, certainly that was, you know, the idea was Britain. Britain was what you like. Britain was plural. It was diverse. I know you don't. We've talked on Twitter before. And I think you've often. I remember saying this once, and you sort of being like, it's funny that you say that, because that's an English thing to look at Britain in that way, because that's not the view of Britain, you know, north of the border. And maybe that's true.
But I mean, this is even people who view Britain really positively in Scotland. It's just Britain is either being Northern Irish, if you want to be, Welsh, Scottish or English. That's it. It's not, it's just part of that. It's not a big debate. It's not a crisis. You know, if you're a nationalist, you don't want to be British. But apart from that, it's just, you just are. And if you're either English British or Scottish British or Northern Irish British or Welsh British, that's it.
I felt a little bit of it when I was there. Like, my experiences here, I'm not going to compare in any way. I got a conversation in a pub, an amazing pub in Islay. It was an amazing pub. It was just complete chaos in that place. There was no...
On Islay?
On Islay, yeah. There was no sense of... Because, you know, this is the middle of the pandemic. So ostensibly the pub is separated into locals and those from outside, but the whole thing would break down by sort of 7 p.m.
So they tried to separate that because of COVID?
Exactly, yeah. It wasn't a political statement.
It wasn't just like, no, basically. Well, you never know people from Islay because you're not from Islay. Doesn't matter whether you're from the Moon, from London, from Glasgow. You're not from Islay.
Right. Okay. I can imagine that. Actually,
it's cool. You're not like us.
It was a very chaotic, wonderful pub. I really like that pub. I got into a chat with this guy, and he was obviously sort of anti-independent, and the way he kept on framing it was she just kept on sort of going like, "Oh, but friends stick together," and I thought that phrase, "friends stick together." I mean, I don't worry about the politics of it, but I thought that ultimately in that was the same kind of idea, and his politics and my politics were very different, right? He was from the right, really. Had the same idea in it as I think the one that I got brought up with about Britain, of like different but together. And just because you're different doesn't mean you have to be in a separate place. So I sort of felt that it was different language and it was a different sort of narrative, but I sort of felt that the same idea was in there. But I accept what you're saying about the England thing. And it kind of tortures me a bit because I sort of think like, if I really dig down into it, do I have the same relationship with England as I have with every other part of my identity, which is that I love and hate it in equal measure, just like I feel about London or I would about Europe or I do about Britain. Of course I do, right? And that's what it is to be brought up somewhere. But for some reason, it just wasn't prioritized. And it always felt, and it might be to do with my generation because I was growing up in sort of, it's a marketing nonsense, but nevertheless, the Cruel Britannia stuff.
The Tony Blair stuff of the 90s.
The Tony Blair stuff, right. So the Union Jack didn't seem threatening. Whereas, to be honest, when you were walking around when I was a kid, if there was a house with a St. George's flag, that was potentially probably a threatening. It almost certainly had people there that you weren't going to be getting on very well with. It was potentially, more threatening. So maybe it has some sort of connection with that. But I think fundamentally that what you're saying is right. It is not a pathway that can be maintained. There has to be some identity with the country. But I'm definitely one of those people that does struggle to find that connection with England.
But I think a lot of people do, and that was the thing that worried me. And I mean, I have this, when you have something like St. George's Day and people say, well, being English isn't very interesting. I'm like, really? Have you been around your country and seen the kind of things that we do? You're fascinating. You're really, really interesting. You're great people and you're really interesting. And you live here and you've got this and you do really mad things that sometimes Scottish people do as well and sometimes we don't. There's some things that are very, it's like there's more than cricket. And a lot of time you're like, even when you're looking at, the stuff that you wrote about in your book, How to Be a Liberal, I mean, this idea of the kind of liberties and just even when you were looking at how early there was religious tolerance compared to anywhere else in Europe and especially Scotland. Well, maybe Spain was probably slightly worse, Inquisition probably torturing people, maybe worse than Scotland. But, the English were really, really tolerant religiously way before anybody else was.
Yeah, well, some of them were at certain points.
But on a kind of longer term scheme, there was this idea of just, you could be here and you could do stuff.
Yeah. There was, you sort of got that period, right? Because, you get Cromwell, obviously, with sort of emancipation of the Jews. Before that, you get the Levellers. So really, we're talking, the mid-1600s. You've got pamphlets from the Levellers, from William Walwyn, from these kind of radical Puritans that are calling for religious freedom, yes, for Jewish people, yes, for Muslims, who they call Turks, obviously, but also in some places for Catholics. And that's where you were like, that is incredibly liberal right there. To even consider it at that period where you're basically at war with someone was amazing. But I don't think we should fool ourselves about how widely accepted those ideas were. No,
but there's a political culture that I think that you create because one of the things that we talk about now, the difference between say Scotland and the kind of Westminster Parliament, I think England is much more tolerant as a country, I think, in terms of the population than Scotland for ethnic minorities and it's really generally a much better place for women. But there's a political culture in Scotland that's really different, and it helps to change the discourse. You arrive in Scotland and you see the videos of the First Minister saying, "You're welcome here. Your contribution is welcome, whether you're from England or whether you're from Pakistan or wherever you're originally from. You are here. You're one of us now. You live here." And I have seen, quite a lot of friends of mine who maybe have moved up. One friend of mine from Shrewsbury. There's another girl from Italy, and they both say, I've been told I'm a new Scot, I've been here for 4 years, I am one of those people. And even if constantly they'll get where are you from that you don't get in London, they still have this idea of the First Minister welcomed me and I'm here and I belong here. In a way that it made me realise how important a political culture is. Because sometimes, when I read when I read your book, I was also thinking a lot of this is very much the elite. You know, it's not about normal punters like me who were, you know, living on wee farms and with fields and trying to grow potatoes. And but then I realised how important a political culture can be, which made me not particularly happy about the one we have at the moment in the UK. But it really made me realise how important a political culture is, which is why people like you think these things are so important.
It's funny that you say, because they're not quite elites, but they call it the middling sort. Mm-hmm. This is the 1600s sort of, mm-hmm. and the same with the French Revolution, same with the American Revolution. They're basically the middle class. They're like the new bourgeoisie. I mean, you couldn't really say the word bourgeoisie because it doesn't get created until they win, basically. Mm-hmm. But they're sort of like lawyers, essentially artisans. It's the middle classes. Those ideas take over, and I suppose they become elite ideas. I'm kind of fascinated by what you said, that it's maybe easier to be a woman in England than it is in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
I'm amazed by that.
If you look at the rates of like employment in terms of like board levels and women in England it's easier to be a woman in England than it is in Scotland work-wise. What happens is, again, because we've got the political culture of Nicola Sturgeon, but she got a glass cliff job. Mm-hmm. Alex lost. He lost a referendum and he resigned, and she took over, and she's just done incredibly well in a way that Theresa May got a glass cliff job. And
didn't do so well.
Well, she didn't do so well because they wouldn't let her. But you know, when you look at, she got a glass cliff job in the same way that Nicola Sturgeon got it, and she did incredibly well. But generally speaking, it is, I would say, when you actually look at percentages of boards, when you look at levels of representation in media, it's definitely better to be a woman down here than it is up there.
That's an incredible thing to say.
Yeah, I'll probably get hate comments below, but
right, yeah. I would say I'll come protect you, but no, I'll just
you'll not. You'll just let me go. Now, you were talking about Islay, mm-hmm. and you were talking about the French Revolution. This is the crappiest segue in the whole world to try some more. I'm kind of
intrigued by where it's going. Yeah,
whiskey and chocolate. So we have their next one, because we've got 3 whiskies and 3 chocolates to try. Mm-hmm. The next one we're having is the Arran Sherry Cask, which I have poured you.
Oh, great!
And you went to Arran last year, didn't you?
Yeah, and I love a bit of sherry cask as well.
So this is 55%, so you probably want to put a wee bit of water in it.
I'm sure.
And the chocolate is from France. It's called Chocolate Bonnat. And it has, if you want to read the ingredients.
Well, how come I keep on getting the posh glasses and you keep on getting these little, what's going on?
Because you're the guest.
This makes me feel bad.
You should feel privileged you get the nicer glasses.
Okay, yeah. Still a tiny sofa, but yeah, no, that's great.
Tiny sofa, nice glasses. You can't have everything in life, Ian.
I know, I take that. Okay, so what am I just taking?
Read out the ingredients so people.
I can't do it, it's all in French.
No, there'll be one in English somewhere.
Okay, well, I can do it. I'm not going to do a French accent. Cacao, beurre de cacao. I think that's pretty sure that's butter. Yeah, sucre, pretty sure that's sugar. And I think that's, because I don't know what that is unless it's another language. All right, okay. Let's ignore the fact that there's an English translation underneath there, and I could have just read that from the fucking start. Okay, great. No, let's have more whiskey. Let's see how that goes.
So, if you want to try the Arran cask first, if you want to put a wee bit of water in it.
I did.
So why do you like a sherry cask whiskey?
I do, yeah. I'm always sort of looking for this, like, I want a bit of sweetness and not too much. It's which is basically the same way I feel about peat. I mean, I'm basically saying the most middle of the road centrist opinion. No. This is classic Blairism right now. Like,
the Tony Blair of whiskey is like in the middle of the road. Sherry cask, not too much sherry cask. Peat, not too much peat. Exactly. But chocolate is kind of dark, but not too dark. Milk, right. But not too much milk. Because I think the thing you notice with this, even on your mouth, is it's heavier than the single grain.
Oh yeah. And it's much more demanding.
And it is that malt whiskey just gives you a more viscous, kind of heavier taste in your mouth.
Mm-hmm. Plus my mouth has to get used to the extra alcohol now.
And this chocolate is 75% cacao, whereas the first one was 70%. And I'm just going to give you a tiny bit because that's easier to...
Thank you. That's very nice. It takes a bit of getting used to.
It's because it's really high percentage.
Yeah. It's lovely though.
It is. I really like Arran whiskey, and it's a really good one to start off with if you like to get yourself into sherry casks. What do you think of the chocolate? It's
very delicious. It's not as interesting as the first one, but it kind of feels more. I hope you appreciate my level of critique here. Mm-hmm. More thoroughly chocolatey, kind of more luxuriously, softly velvety chocolatey than the one before.
I'm trying the whiskey. Think you know.
So I'm going to try and make as few aroused noises during the course of this conversation as humanly possible. That's very, very good to go. I see what you've done here. Mm-hmm. I see the choices that you've made here. These
Honestly,
are very good choices.
I have at some points, I have sweated whiskey and chocolate at various times. One time, I sat in a friend's house and I went through about 10 different whiskies and about 15 different chocolates, and at the end I was like, I never want to see whiskey and chocolate again. And I lasted 2 days without either whiskey or chocolate.
Can you is it just intuitive how you selected, or can you describe it? Is there like a process that you use for figuring
There's
out?
stuff that I think would work now that the thing about this, that whiskey and chocolate isn't codified in what goes and what doesn't at all, in a way that because Cocoa Runners has been doing wine tastings for quite a few years, they kind of know the ballpark of what kind of chocolate will work with wine. Mm-hmm. It's mostly just been me sitting with tiny bits of chocolate and tiny bits of whiskey going, that works, that doesn't, that works, that doesn't. Sometimes you find like a stronger whiskey generally needs a slightly softer chocolate. If you had like the Loch Lomond with a really kind of soft milk chocolate, they don't do anything for each other.
Right.
You need it's like you need the Conexion 70, you need something, and the texture, because you got the texture from the nibs and you have the very fine mouthfeel of grain whiskey, it goes really well.
So you're doing the opposite of what you would do with like cheese and wine, right? Where usually you want strong cheese, nice sort of full-bodied red, versus here you actually want a contradiction between the two of them.
So the one that I've had the one that took a long time to find a match for was the Bruch Laddie, like the traditional laddie of the Bruch Laddie, because although it's not peated, it's got a sort of lactic taste to it, and it really needed something sweet. And I think I tried about 15 different chocolates. And see how when you're saying when you put that in your mouth and then you have the whiskey, you go, that's amazing. When it doesn't work, it really doesn't work. We did it a few months ago in a market. There was a lot of chocolate producers, and I would arrive with a whiskey going, right, we're doing a tasting, I need to find a chocolate that will go. And they would say, oh, this one will go. And I knew it wouldn't, but I thought if I tell them it doesn't, they're not going to listen to me. I need them to discover themselves. And sometimes they'd be like, oh my God, my chocolate's horrible. What happened? It's like, it just doesn't go. And then they tried something, and I'd be like, I think it might go with that one. And then we tried something else, and they were like, this is amazing. I didn't know my chocolate was this good. And that's the thing I find interesting about it, is that this kind of stuff is what I do now instead of going clubbing. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like, I mean, I hung up my hot pants a long time ago. I don't think they'd even fit on my arms nowadays. And this kind of stuff of like, you know, good chocolate and good whiskey and trying to match them and just seeing what goes is, I think it's a really good fun thing to do. Mm-hmm. And I do really enjoy it.
Yeah, I can understand why you might enjoy it. Yeah, there's also like a unique kind of pleasure to paying attention to what you're consuming. Mm-hmm. So I feel like I go through so much of my life, especially like, you know, because if you think of your entertainment now, so much of it is just endless streaming. You know, a movie ends on Netflix, another one starts. You know, a song ends on Spotify, another one will come on. Then you go out and you have a meal and you drink your wine and you probably pay attention to like the first sip. And afterwards you stop. When you sit with people who know what they're talking about, but even, you know, if you're just at home with the missus and you actually just think to yourself, no, I'm actually going to pay attention to the things I'm consuming, you actually find stuff in it that you wouldn't have found otherwise. And this sounds a little bit American and I'm probably going to regret it, but it does feel like you're more in the moment. Like you're actually part of the moment and paying attention to your surroundings. Which just in that sort of constant flux of content coming in, work that has to be produced, consuming this and that, it's quite easy to just sort of go to bed and just think, oh, did I actually enjoy any of that? Or did I just sort of exist through it?
And do you know, I mean, that was the thing I've noticed about the difference, for example, between your everyday life, which is very much so-and-so just said this in Parliament, which can be your day-to-day life. Well, you know, whether you're reporting on it in a column or whether you're doing it on Twitter. The thing I really realised with that book was you really had to take a really long view of like 400 years and read a lot of history and read a lot of this is where we are now, this is how we got here, that started 400 years ago. Yeah. It's a completely different way of looking at the world. And I imagine, I mean, I know writing a book is very stressful, but did you find that, but did you find that in bits of it quite calming, that all of a sudden you were looking at things from a longer lens?
I fucking hated every second of it.
Did you?
I hated it.
Did you really hate it?
I really don't like writing books.
Did you hate doing the research?
I despise the research. Okay, so there's a bit that's okay. The reading is okay and the talking is okay. And then the writing is okay. But there's this huge sort of gulf between the actual reading and the writing. You've got to get all this stuff and put it in order and think what your thoughts are. Especially with the philosophy, you kind of need to grasp it, spend a bit of time on your own contemplative. I hate fucking having to contemplate anything. Thinking it through, processing it, then talking to experts about it and seeing what you object to, what you agree with. All of that's really very hard. And I really despised it. Book writing is very difficult, I think, especially for a journalist. Because journalism, it's quite simple, right? You have the story, you have the column. It would take you at most 2 days, but usually 4 hours. It gets published, and then you get the response. So a bunch of people hate you and tell you that you're the most dreadful person on earth, but also a lot of people read it and think, okay, this helped me, and blah, blah. So you get the sort of social reward very fast. With a book, I mean, you spend a year on that thing before anyone even knows it exists. Mm-hmm. You know, you just sat there at sort of 10 p.m. reading, you know, John Stuart Mill when your mates are in the pub. It sucks. It's absolutely dreadful. I mean, it really does pain you. I always sort of, when I was growing up, you'd hear those authors go, oh, writing a book, it's like having a baby. You know, it's so painful. It's so hard to give birth to it. And you just think, you whiny bastard. All you have to do is sit where it's warm and pleasant and clean and write a fucking book. Like, stop complaining. And now I kind of get it. I've said all the same shit myself. I'm just like, oh, it really hurts giving birth to a book. You know, I say all of that wanky stuff myself.
That's a shame.
I'm sorry.
No, it's a shame because I think there is that need, and you know what you're saying genuinely about something like this is that just sitting down and pausing and paying attention to tastes. I think it's actually a really good thing to do, and I was hoping that you were going to say that managing to take a longer view of things maybe gave you a slightly better perspective. Yeah,
but this is nice. This is whiskey and chocolate. This is
true.
Sensory pleasure. I mean, this is great. I mean, reading about, you know, monetary theory, that is not the same thing. That is a profoundly grueling and unpleasant experience. So no, I mean, I don't ever want to have to do that again. The thing that was similar to it about the journalism is that you're always sort of in a game of, how can you explain a complex thing to people as easily as possible? And for a lot of the time, that's sort of trade mechanics or it's parliamentary processes. And in this, it's just a question of, this is the philosophy, this is the history. And I think what does help is if you're a bit bored by it, if you really hate economics and philosophy and history, and I do, then you become
You've got a degree in philosophy.
I do, well, I hated that. I barely fucking went to it. And then you become much better at communicating it to people because it's very easy for you to imagine what it's like to want this made as simple and entertaining as possible because you are literally that person. So you very quickly get that grasp of what the details you don't really need to go into, what's the most interesting thing about it, what's the easiest delivery mechanism to make it as painless an experience as possible, to just retrieve this knowledge, to get this knowledge for yourself.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it was worth it? No, obviously, because it sounds like you did it as a labour of love and for other people, almost like it was your duty to do this book. And now that it's out there and been out there for over a year now,
mm-hmm.
Do you think it's been worth it?
Yeah, this stuff is always worth it. There has to be a public benefit. You have to, if you don't think that there's any public service by virtue of doing it, you wouldn't do it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's easy as an author because you're dealing with self-selecting audiences. You know, you go around, you go to towns all over the country, and then you talk about it, and people come up to you and go, "Well, this is the first moment that I grasped what it was that I believed in." And that was my suspicion, right? That for liberal-minded people, they knew what they believed in, but they didn't know their heritage.
And they'd never really had to think about it because
because they were winning.
They were always winning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and now we're not. We're the barbarians at the gate. We're losing. And so it was for them. And it's not a real attempt to convince others, although I've spoken to sort of, you know, conservatives and people on sort of the further reaches of the left who are convinced by some aspects of it, let's put it that way. But generally speaking, this is for people who feel like something has gone terribly, terribly wrong in the world and want to have a firmer grasp of what are the exact convictions, what's the history of the convictions that are currently being sort of trampled on. So I think it works for that, but then I would, right? I mean, by virtue of being the person who writes it, I'm not going to be like, no, it's a fucking waste of time. Like, we're absolutely buggered and we're all going to die.
No, but there is that thing of you writing this and thinking, what am I doing this for? I mean, admittedly, I have this on very few moments, but sometimes genuinely after 12 whiskies and 12 chocolates, I'm like, why does everyone want to do this? Why does anybody want to drink whiskey? Why does anybody want to eat chocolate? I'm just going to have tea and soup forever, and it lasts a day. And then the next day I'm like, right, what's the whiskey? What's the chocolate? Where am I going to have this now?
I know.
And to be fair, and this is a lot easier than John Stuart Mill.
I want to know about that.
Oh, definitely. I don't think I could sit and read John Stuart Mill with the same love that I could drink whiskey.
Has that always been whiskey for you?
Actually, no. What I do is Spanish food. I used to live there, and what I know is Spanish food.
Oh, wow.
But nobody would give me a book about Spanish food. And so I said to my agent one day, well, I don't do a book about cooking and whiskey. And he said, well, do you want to do 100 recipes? And I said, no, there's about 4 books with 100 recipes. Why don't do a book about going around Scotland, drinking whiskey and learning about whiskey? And he went, I think I can settle that. And I just thought, no one is ever going to give me money, especially a woman. They're not going to give anybody, but especially not a woman, money to go around Scotland and learning about whiskey. And they did. Simon & Schuster said, here's some money, off you go.
That's basically the best gig I've ever heard in my life.
It was pretty good. Writing it was not so good, as you can understand. Mm-hmm. But I got paid to go around Scotland drinking whiskey.
Why would they... Is it this heritage thing in sort of recipe books that basically everyone's supposed to tell their personal story of the recipes?
No,
so Spanish was off the
no. The thing that happened with Spanish stuff was genuinely Rick Stein's Spain books sold less than Rick Stein books normally sell. I see. So they didn't think that a Spanish book was actually going to work. The other issue, I do think there was a slight issue of cookbooks had become my heritage, so I'd had the wrong surname. You know, McCormack's not a very Spanish surname. Mm-hmm. And when I said to my agent, well, what if I try and sell them Scotland? He's like, yeah, it's much easier. Right. Because there is that, but I do think there has been that reclamation, which I think is very true. I think it's really good that people from a certain background are being able to sell their food as opposed to it being another posh white person selling their food. But the other side of that is if you know a lot about another country's food, you can't get a book about it. It's quite hard. The only person who's been really successful is Rachel Roddy, but she lives in Rome, which is a different thing. I think if I lived in Spain, it would possibly be slightly easier. But I don't anymore, so... But I think genuinely with publishing, the biggest thing was that Rick Stein's Spanish books didn't sell very much. Okay. Yeah, because people are suspicious of Spanish food. I think it is because I was in Tenerife before all of COVID started. The last place I went abroad was Tenerife. And I was wandering around these kind of places that were just tourist tapas bars. And I thought, my God, this is what most English people think Spanish food is. Mm-hmm. Of course they're not interested in buying a book about Spain, because they think this is Spain and they think this is Spanish food, as opposed to stuff for tourists. Okay. Which is a whole different ballgame. I think I'm one of them. I mean, look, it would be remiss if I don't mention it now. I have to mention it now. So the most trouble I ever got in on Twitter was when I was slagging off Spanish food. Well, see, this is the thing though. If you think that English people can be really abusive and annoying on Twitter, and Scottish people can be that real Presbyterian, just horrible to everything. Mm-hmm. Spanish people, when they go crazy on Twitter, are scary. Dude. They are scary. They came for me as well. I mean, and they came for me. They swear. And they go from, you're a really nice person, to you deserve to die. And I am going to come around and kill you now. And you're like, well, that escalated. And when you say, do you think this is a reasonable thing to say? They say yes. They came into my Facebook Messenger with threats against my person because I'd slagged off, was it patatas bravas? And you just didn't like them? It's just crap, isn't it? It's just like crap chips. I'm not saying that. I actually quite like patatas bravas. Okay. If you get nice patatas bravas, they're very nice. Yeah, and you see, well, as you were saying, I was sort of realising the depths of my ignorance. I usually try to flee from moments like that, but I'm kind of trapped in now. So I think I should appreciate... I'm basically talking about, it's Madrid, Barcelona, and probably like a few beaches where I've had it. I just don't really get... I've never really had like a fantastic Spanish meal. I've had a really nice night eating Spanish food. But then you need to go to the Royal Academy and have Jose Pizarro's food. I didn't think you were going to say the Royal Academy. He has taken over the Royal Academy, and then you will see what Spanish food can do. I promise you. Okay, I'll do that. You'll be like, now I understand why people really like Spanish food. Okay. His stuff is really, really good.
All right, I will 100%
So
do
you
that
need to
before
go to
I
Royal Academy
comment on the subject
and
again.
try Hoseby Tharos food.
Okay.
And I promise you, you will not be disappointed.
Does it have any cheese apart from manchego? Because I sort of feel like they've done the manchego thing and they just need to branch out. You just need to take a risk out of
I'm sure
that.
it does, and they will have other cheeses. They'll have Montenegro, and they will have Mahon, and they will have. I'm sure they will have.
Right, I'm also going to shut my mouth before I get in trouble with the Spanish again. I don't want to ever go through that shit again. So yeah, great.
So the last whiskey is a peated whiskey, and it's from the Glasgow distillery. There you go. Here's your glass. It's the first one.
Right. Yes, that's good. That's great. That's
It's a really new distillery, so the whiskey's really young. And it was a new distillery that they built in Glasgow about 2010, 2012, and it's the first malt whiskey distillery in Glasgow for over 130 years.
Okay.
Apart from the one that, there was an illegal one that one of my dad's friends was telling me about. He basically he read my book and then told me, why didn't you tell this story? And I'm like, well, George, you never told me this story, so how was I supposed to know that by something of osmosis or telepathy? Aye, right enough, Rachel. So there was somebody on like George Square, like near George Square in Bath Street, who he was a night watchman and he had the chimney all blocked and he ran an illegal distill there, and apparently he paid off most of the policemen, so everybody just ignored it. This was in the 60s. And the problem was, one of the night watchmen, when he wasn't there, unblocked the chimney because it was really cold, and put a fire in the building, like in the chimney, and the chimney went on fire because it was blocked from the top. And then the problem was that a policeman arrived who was from the islands, and he knew exactly what he was smelling. He knew he was smelling an illegal distillery, and because Malky hadn't paid him, they closed it down. But this distillery is legal. This is and they called it the 1770 whiskey because that was when the previous malt whiskey distillery was first built.
Okay, how old is this?
It'll probably be about 3 years old, 3.5. Oh, wow. It's a really young whiskey. Mm-hmm. And it's peated.
I would never have guessed that was only 3 years.
They're good at what they do.
Mm-hmm. It feels really grown up. It's absolutely lovely. It's like just the right amount of sweetness. The peat isn't overwhelming at all. It kind of makes it feel quite mature. It's really good. I would never in a million years have guessed that was 3 years.
There's a few distilleries, young distilleries, that are doing really good stuff that's really young. There's there's Rassie, who they've now got really good whiskey out as well, and they're very young. And there's Lindors, they are near, I think they're in Fife. They're just kind of near Edinburgh, so I would imagine they're over the river, so they must be in Fife. They are doing really good stuff as well. There's quite a few young distilleries that, before, say a few years ago, there was a couple of distilleries releasing stuff that was 3 years old. And you can even see in the comments, people always try and be positive because if they're a young distillery and they're releasing stuff after 3 years old, they need to start selling the whiskey. And they're like, oh, I can't wait to taste this one when it's 8 years old. Mm-hmm. It's code for, oh my God, it's just burned everything in me. But these ones I think are really, really, really good. And I really like this Glasgow distillery. And I think it's a really good introduction to peated whiskey.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Because it's kind of a middle of the road peated whiskey. It's not incredibly strong, but it's not really soft. It's not really lightly peated like Highland Park, and it's not really heavily peated like Lafroig. Right.
I can't handle Lafroig at all. I mean, I tried.
It's just not for you.
You know what it tastes like to me? It tastes like when I was a kid and I tried my dad's beer or something, and you're like, how can anyone like this drink? How is it possible? That's basically what it reduces me to. I'm just like, I know this is a thing I should be able to appreciate, but I just can't. Or like being 8 years old and having Stilton or something. It's just it's basically too grown up for me. I'm just too much of a child for it still.
See, I totally disagree. I think there's a thing with whiskey that I think you like what you like. And I just think that to me, the great advantage of it is there's so many different flavour profiles in whiskey that there's always one you like. If you drink any kind of liqueur spirits, there'll be a whiskey for you. You just have to find it. Right. You know, when you look at what we started off with, the difference in taste between the Loch Lomond and the Glasgow distillery, they're really, really different tastes. And I think if one whiskey isn't for you, it's just not for you. It's not because you're a boost. It's not because this. It's not because of that.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Because the thing that happens a lot in whiskey tastings is the last whiskey is the peated whiskey. So people always think that's the best whiskey. That's just the peated whiskey. Mm-hmm. You might like something much more nuanced. You might like something that's subtler. And I mean, Speyside whiskey is amazing. It's not generally peated, but it's fabulous.
I just got this impression that, there was like sort of the real discerning whiskey taster usually drifts towards peat, more and more peat as they get older.
See, Mark Watt, who is probably one of the biggest whiskey experts, he always says that one of the things he thinks that peated whiskies become like the Saturday night curry. A bunch of drunk guys who want the hottest curry possible because they feel that that's the right thing to have. And he feels that sometimes peated whiskies becoming a bit like the Saturday night curry of whiskey. And he loves peated whiskey, but he says, people's idea of it has become the more peat, the better. And he's like, it's not, it's not a drunken curry in a provincial town in the UK. It's whiskey, and it's got different flavour profiles that you might like or you might not. And it's just one of those things that's happened. But let's have the last chocolate with it.
Okay.
Which I can open. Let's see, except I've opened the wrong end.
You're going to make me read the ingredients out again.
Yeah, I'll read the ingredients so that you know. So this is Menakao chocolate from Madagascar, and this is 72%. So the first one is 70. In the way that in whiskey you get obsessed with alcohol ABVs, so it's just 40% to 52. With chocolate you get obsessed with how much cocoa.
This is not something I've ever thought about. Yeah.
Well, you will now. So you'll be standing there looking at one. There's 70% here. That one's the second one. The chocolate Bonnat's 75, and the Menakao's 72.
And you're usually hovering around that mark, that sort of like early 70s.
For these whiskey, for the chocolates that match these whiskies, yes. But for dark chocolate, yes. But you can also get 100%. There's like variety of everything. But for dark chocolate, I think you're hovering around early 70s normally. Mm-hmm. So this is from Madagascar. Again, it's probably it's basically cocoa mass and sugar. And I want you to see the difference between the other two chocolates as well. So,
on what basis why is the flavour between these chocolates changing so much, given that the ingredients are always the same?
Same way that whiskey changes. It's the way that it's been processed. It's sometimes the cocoa bean. Cocoa beans can be quite different in the way that wine grapes are quite different. But again, because we're just used to this kind of really cheap mass-produced chocolate, we don't get that cocoa beans have almost the same variety as wine grapes, and they also kind of the same variety of tastes as whiskey.
I see. Okay, so but it's not to do with storage in any sort of way. It's always
possibly it's to do with the way that each company has also processed that bean, what they've done, how long they've tempered it for, or how long they've ground it for. Sometimes that how long they've fermented the beans for, how long the roast has been, but a lot of the time it's the actual bean.
Okay.
So try this.
I will.
No, you want to ask something?
Well, I mean, can they distinguish between these beans? I mean, when you're sort of really into chocolate, are you thinking about different kinds of beans all the time and different altitudes?
There's a guy in Denmark who's obsessed with like cocoa DNA. Fritz Holm, he runs a chocolate company called Fritz Holm, and he's obsessed with cacao DNA, and I don't want to get into that because it's like I'd lose my life. I think I've left enough of my life to whiskey. I think if I start finding out what is the DNA of this cocoa bean and what's the DNA of that cocoa bean, I'm going to lose the plot.
I don't know, man. I mean, that sounds like a nerdery that you should probably get into.
I mean, it's quite good fun.
Thanks. And it's always quite small, the amount of chocolate that we're having. It's a very different experience for me. I'm so used to just munching chocolate without much joy or appreciation, that actually being forced to sit there with the chocolate.
Well, that's, I think, the thing about these things that I like is it does give you some pleasure and some joy to discuss what are the different types of chocolate, what are the different ways that chocolate tastes when it's the same ingredients, how it goes with the whiskey. Mm-hmm. It's a totally different thing from just sitting drinking Bacardi Breezers and knocking back cheap chocolate.
Right.
It is a totally different experience.
This probably feels even more luxurious than the last one.
Did you get anything at the back? Like up here?
What should I be looking for?
Possibly.
No, it's kind of like slightly sweet. Mm-hmm. It's slightly fruity.
It's the fruit. I find it amazing that again with the chocolate Bonnat, people think there's coconut in there, and with this one, people think there's been fruit added. And the same way that you said with the Conexion, you were like, has this got orange peel in it? But I think with the Menakao, it's like there's a kind of fruit taste at the back.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if I'd have appreciated that without you saying it. It's true though, and now obviously it's the only thing I can taste.
And try it with the whiskey now, see what you think.
That's an extremely pleasant experience. Slightly aniseedy. That's absolutely delicious.
And it changes the whiskey and changes the chocolate.
Do you have to go back to Scotland? Can you just stay here?
What, just stay here and just keep giving you
Curate
whiskey
my
and
evenings.
chocolate?
I would really appreciate that. I feel like I got a tremendous amount of joy out of that. That was absolutely fantastic.
I can't stay in London, but we do have sub boxes and subscription boxes, and you can get this in your house every month. And
I mean, I was happy with the subscription box, but now I want you to talk me through it. I feel like you've introduced me to a new world, and now you will depart.
I will depart, but I will still be available on video and on Zoom. And I am up and down, but I am available on video on the Cocoa Runners website, so you can find me talking about whiskey and chocolate. And then when Spencer comes, you get like the proper chocolate information as opposed to mine, which is read out the ingredients. Because he knows all about, like, he's the kind of guy that knows all about the DNA of a cocoa bean.
Oh wow! Huh.
And I don't. So, but he's great at that kind of thing. But thank you very much for coming on our first ever YouTube programme about whiskey and chocolate, and it was really lovely to see you.
Come on, this was fantastic. This is like God level Tuesday night right here. It can't be improved. This is perfect.
This is very true, and thank you. But thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoy your whiskey and chocolate.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching.